President Trump has at last woken up our political leaders to do what people like me did try to get them to do a lot earlier.
Let's go now straight to Lord Richards, David Richards, the former Chief of the Defence Staff, the head of the British Armed Forces. Hello to you.
Good morning, Adam.
Just want to ask you your assessment of the military situation currently in Ukraine. Is it sustainable for Ukraine to fight on?
No, I never thought, sadly, as much as like most people, emotionally, I was with them 150%, that tactically and strategically they were going to win, if you like, although none of our politicians nor the Ukrainians actually ever defined victory, which doesn't help in terms of planning a military campaign. But I think they had an opportunity in the first year, towards the end of it, to seek a pretty favourable ceasefire. But people like Boris Johnson and many others, including some military men who should have known better, encouraged them to go on fighting. In fact, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in America at that time, said they are at their high watermark. And I'm afraid he was right. And it's been a bit downhill ever since. So I'm absolutely convinced that President Trump is right in principle. We may not like some of his tactics, but right in principle now to try to impose a peace on them and to make it as favourable as possible into the long term for Ukraine.
Because the counter-argument, of course, is that, as you say, in the first year of the war, Russia didn't overwhelm Ukraine, and still, although it occupies about a fifth of the territory of Ukraine, its advances are still pretty slow.
They are, but they're inexorable, and I think it's going to grow, particularly, of course, and this is the big new factor, without American support. And they are in a position right now, as I understand it, tactically, where the Kursk salient, as one might call it, that's the Ukrainian annexation of a small part of Russia, is under severe attack from the Russians, obviously intending to get that back before any ceasefire might be agreed. And the situation in the East is not that good either. To give you a feel for it, how much this has bled Ukraine beyond the huge migration out of Ukraine by a lot of people, there are something like 100,000 amputees in Ukraine at the moment, amputees caused by the war. It's just not sustainable when the population balance is so out of kilter between Russia and Ukraine. So it is time to call a halt to this and to make Ukraine's longer-term future as robust as we can all do.
How do you assess the impact of the withdrawal of American support, both in terms of intelligence and military aid?
Well, I think everyone knows it is absolutely huge. I'll give you another feel for it, because maybe you want to talk about the French-British approach. But back in 2011, when I was CDS and we did the Libya operation, we could not do it without detailed American support and involvement. We just didn't have it. And a lot of that was to do with intelligence and what's known in the trade as sort of enablers, command and control. The same applies now to Ukraine. Without that intelligence feed, allowing them to anticipate Russian attacks and so on, it's very, very difficult. And no one other than the Americans have got it, sadly.
Given Trump's attitude, we probably need it pretty rapidly to develop our own, don't we?
Well, there's a big question, and everyone's talking about, we're going to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence in this country by 2027. I can tell you it would take something like 4% for 10 years to get anywhere near like the capability the Americans have, which is why in this rough old world we're living in, and which great power competition seems to have become back in vogue, sometimes you better do as your great power ally wants you to do. And in this case, Europe
surrender to the Russians, you mean?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily that far, but I think quite clearly what President Trump is saying, and he said it in 2016, and President Eisenhower said it in the 50s, is Europe's got to stop freeloading on America and start investing properly in their own defence. So in that respect, we need to do so quickly and efficiently. But I can tell you, Adam, it'll still take the best part of another 10 years to even begin to replicate what America and NATO does for us.
Got to say, you sound pretty defeatist on all of this. I mean, do you look back on your career when you had a lot of influence as, you didn't do what you should have done?
Well, if you're talking about fighting with my political masters to get more put into defence, like every other chief of defence and head of individual armed forces, and of course this isn't often revealed because you do these things mainly behind closed doors, although I got into a bit of trouble sometimes to do it. We fought very hard, and without that fight, I think things would be even worse. But the fact is, there was a post-Cold War feeling of euphoria. It didn't look like we were going to fight a state-on-state conflict ever again in the eyes of, even though people like me said, oh, yes, it's going to come one day. And we weren't listened to. But I'm not exonerating myself. We're all guilty. And President Trump has at last woken up our political leaders to do what people like me did try to get them to do a lot earlier.
But the question is whether he is still our ally, whether he's justified in criticism of European defence spending. If he's not going to support us, if he's talking about claiming territory from Canada, who's a fellow member of NATO, in those circumstances, is it remotely conceivable that France and Britain, with other allies, could go ahead and try and offer some kind of security guarantee to whatever is left of Ukraine after a peace settlement?
Well, there's the Ukraine issue, and then there's the wider, longer-term issue of NATO. On Ukraine, let me be quite blunt, and one or two of your listeners have remarked on this. There is no way that we, without America, can offer a credible deterrent to any Russian adventurism. The right way to do this is to build up Ukraine's defense. They've proved very capable at doing this. As you said earlier, the Russians aren't actually getting a free ride by any means. So we should invest massively in the Ukrainians' defensive capability. And this would involve lots more than just sort of the sort of obvious things like tanks, but the more technical aspects of modern fighting. And then there is a case for NATO countries, European countries, not in their NATO guise, being in Ukraine in a supporting technical logistic role, but not in this so-called peacekeeping role, which I think Ukraine would do much more efficiently without the risk of us being drawn into a fight with Russian forces that we're just not capable of properly responding to.
I suppose the point would be that they would be a kind of tripwire and in that sense, a deterrent, because it would say to Russia, if you do move in on what remains of Ukraine, there will be consequences.
Yeah, and Adam, I know what you might be thinking when you ask that, and I'm thinking, yes, what consequences? Because without America's intimate involvement, we have very little to offer in retaliation to the Russians. And I learned two things, a few other things when I was serving, but one of them is if you really want to stay good and strong in defense, stay close to America. And secondly, when you do go into some sort of conflict, make sure you're robust and strong, able to defend yourself and re-establish the initiative. I fear that the latter would not be possible without much bigger allied forces, French, British and so on, than is currently not only being talked about, but is even possible because, for example, the British Army has got barely one brigade that it can deploy into the field and in any way be counted as sort of able to fight for itself. And the French are no better. So it's a long way off being in a position where we might be able to plausibly deter Russian adventurism.
But
Let us
Are
break.
you confident we can continue to, as you put it, stay close to America, that we can continue to rely on America?
Yeah, I may be quite wrong. First to admit I regularly am, but I think the geostrategic reality of America's position will ensure that we and the Americans can stay close. As one, I think Adam Thompson said earlier, the Americans have not said they are leaving NATO. They've worried a lot of European politicians. I think there's been a slightly hysterical reaction to that. Play a long game, do what they are after, which we're beginning to do, and I see no reason why history won't out and we'll remain closely aligned with America. Particularly, it's in our interest over time to do as some of your correspondents have been suggesting, and I have for a while too, grand strategically, we want to divide Russia from China. And I know it'll be post-Putin and all the things that we associate with today's Moscow regime, but in due course, Russia isn't going away. She will remain a great power of some kind, and we need to bring her into the body of the Kirk and then focus with America doing the muscle lifting for us on China.
Lord Richards, David Richards, thank you very much indeed. You're listening to Times Radio.